What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today. We're heading into week 3, and I've heard a lot of talk over the past couple days about how weak the slate is, about how there aren't many good games, about how there's only one ranked versus ranked matchup on Saturday, and we all know what that means. It happens every year. Every time there's a week where it doesn't seem like there's a lot going on, there's basically always multiple major upsets, crazy games, stuff like that end up making the week total chaos. So I'm really looking forward to it and seeing how it all plays out. Let's get right into it. Number 24 Boston College travels to number 6 Missouri for the only ranked versus ranked matchup on Saturday. This is where college game day should be, but we'll talk about that later. Quarterback Thomas Castellanos and the Eagles have a ton of momentum. They're ranked for the first time since 2018 and get a major opportunity to further themselves in the national conversation this week. Number 6 Missouri has their highest AP poll ranking since 2013, the highest of the college football playoff era. They're 2-0 with 2 shutouts, and they are one of just 2 teams in the FBS who have not allowed a single point this year. And the other is Purdue, and they've only played 1 game. So they are the only team who has played 2 games and not allowed a single point so far, which is pretty wild. And the competition is what it is. They beat Murray State 51-0 and Buffalo 38-0. So I don't really care who you're playing, though. 89-0 through 2 weeks is absurd. Missouri is a 17-point favorite. The over-under is 53.5, which gives us an implied score of 35-18 Tigers. Interestingly enough, this is the second time that Boston College has faced an AP Top 10 opponent this year, and the second time that they've been exactly a 17-point underdog, with the first being to Florida State, who they beat by 15. And of course, Florida State really wasn't a top 10 team then. They were only number 10 because there wasn't an AP poll after week 0 to update after their loss to Georgia Tech. So it's still pretty intriguing, though, that it's the same value according to Vegas. Both games on the road, too. Boston College at Florida State, 17-point underdog. Boston College at Missouri, 17-point underdog. And they beat Florida State by 15 and easily could have been 20 plus. So point being, this spread seems a little bit too wide, to be completely honest. I think Boston College is being undersold here. I think Missouri is a very good team, of course, but they really haven't had a real test, and they've done what you're supposed to do to teams who you're large favorites over and who they're expected to beat, and they've looked good in doing so. But they beat their FCS opponent 51-0. Boston College beat theirs 56-0. They've both done what they should do to inferior opposition. BC already has experience on the road this season, going into a hostile environment, going on the road to a Power 4 team, and they really had their way in Doak Campbell Stadium with Florida State. And say what you want about the Noles, that's a team with a very talented roster. That was a situation where their backs were against the wall. They were trying to rebound from that week 0 loss. They were trying to keep that momentum from their season last year, of course, and BC went in there and had their way with them. And it was a 15-point margin, like I said, and easily could have been 35-13 if Bill O'Brien hadn't kneeled it out at the 5-yard line. I think Castellanos at quarterback poses a very difficult challenge for basically any team that they play. He has 421 total yards and 7 total touchdowns so far this season with 0 turnovers. He's 19 of 26 passing, so he hasn't really had to throw the ball that much, but that's still a 73.1% completion percentage. Against their FCS team last week, he was 9 of 10 for 234 yards and 4 touchdowns. 9 completions, 4 touchdowns, which is just crazy. So he hasn't had to throw the ball that much, but they definitely can if need be. And something I saw this week that I was shocked by is that Brady Cook, Missouri's quarterback, has just 1 passing touchdown and 1 interception so far this season. And star receiver Luther Burden has just 64 yards receiving through 2 games. So granted, similar situation to Boston College passing-wise where they just haven't needed to. They haven't really needed Cook or Burden or Weiss or any of those guys to really go crazy due to the competition, but pretty interestingly low amount of production there so far. Another reason that I think this game will be much closer than the Vegas projection is Bill O'Brien's approach on offense, and specifically what he did to FSU. If they're able to have success with those deliberately long drives where they can kind of play keep away from Missouri for a while, I think they'll be able to stay in it. And against FSU in week 1, for example, BC possessed the ball for 40 minutes of the 60 minutes on the clock. They had the ball for 17 of the first 20 minutes of the game. They kept the ball away from Florida State's offense for 2/3 of the time that was on the clock. So The biggest key to this game, from my perspective, is Boston College's success on third down. If they're able to convert the 3rd and 4s, the 3rd and 6s, plays like that, maybe a 4th and 1, a 4th and 2 or something, if they're able to lengthen those drives and keep the ball away from Brady Cook and Luther Burden and Theo Weiss and that offense that has potential to explode, I think they can not only stay in the game, but potentially have themselves in position to steal one in Columbia. Number 20 Arizona travels to number 14 Kansas State on Friday night. There's just 2 ranked matchups this week, and one of them is on Friday, which I actually really like. I'd prefer there be more than 2 matchups, but the fact that there's 2 and one's on Friday where we can kind of give it a standalone slot and all get dialed into it, I think is really fun. Last week was a little sketchy for both teams. Arizona was in a dogfight with FCS Northern Arizona for a while on Saturday. NAU actually led that game 10-6 at the half, and wide receiver Tetero McMillan, who looked absolutely unstoppable in week 1, had just 2 receptions for 11 yards. The whole game, 2 receptions for 11 yards after dropping 300 the week before. So he has 315 yards receiving on the season, and those came in groups of 304 and 11, which is wild. He was 7th on the team in receiving for Arizona. 6 other players had more yards against NAU than him, which is wild. They really shut him down, and that was one of the biggest shockers of week 2. Noah Fafita at quarterback was just 18 of 26 for 173 yards, a touchdown, and a pick. And I don't know if this was a look-ahead spot for the team where they blew out New Mexico in week 1, and they're like, all right, we've got the FCS team coming up, and then a major trip on the road to K-State in a couple weeks. And maybe they just got caught looking ahead to week 3, but it was really an unimpressive performance. Now, Arizona did win the game 22-10. They got the job done, and maybe it was a little bit of a wake-up call heading into week 3 for this matchup with Kansas State. K-State very, very nearly lost on the road at Tulane. The Wildcats pulled out a 34-27 victory after a late scoop and score touchdown that really flipped the game. And of course, Tulane is a solid program, certainly better than Northern Arizona, but a game that Kansas State really could have lost. And Tulane had a touchdown taken off the board late due to an offensive pass interference call. They had a couple really close calls that could have had that game in overtime, if not in a victory for the Green Wave. But K-State pulled it out, and now we've got a major Big 12 matchup between the 2 Wildcats. Kansas State is a 7.5-point favorite. The over-under is 59.5, giving us an implied score of right around 34-26 Kansas State. So this spread is at the top end of what I thought it would be, and now 7.5 is 1 touchdown, and that can mean that the game goes to double overtime or something, and Kansas State scores and gets a 2-point conversion to cover, but I thought it would be just a little bit tighter. I haven't necessarily been crazy impressed by either team yet other than McMillan's performance in week 1, but even then, Arizona's team as a whole gave up 39 to New Mexico. So, and then, of course, last week they struggled with Northern Arizona. And then Kansas State trailed most of the game against Tulane. They went into that game as either 9 or 10-point favorites, I think. And like I said, Tulane's a respectable program, but Kansas State really trailed that game for almost the entirety of it. And then even in their week 1 game against their FCS opponent in UT Martin, they won 41-6, but if you look deeper into that game, it was 17-6 late in the third quarter before they kind of out-depthed them and really wore them out late. So I really have no strong lean here. If I had to pick one way or the other, I'd probably take Arizona to at least cover that 7.5-point spread. And if McMillan's able to have a bounce-back game and get back on track, I think Arizona might be able to win it. But either way, I can see this being a great game that goes down to the wire. Number 4, Alabama travels to Wisconsin. The Crimson Tide is a 16-point favorite. Over-under is 50.5, giving us an implied score of 33-17 Tide. And both teams had their share of struggles last week. Alabama had one of the most deceptive final scores ever against the USF. I talked about it in the Week 2 recap video, but yeah, Alabama beat USF 42-16, but if you watch that game, it was far, far closer than that. Wisconsin beat FCS South Dakota by 14. The Badgers now have a 28-14 win over Western Michigan and a 27-13 win over South Dakota, so they're 2-0, but those 2 wins have been remarkably ugly. And winning a game is obviously always good, but those performances against Western Michigan and their FCS opponent, it just doesn't exactly instill a lot of confidence in their ability to really compete with Alabama. To make the case that the Badgers might be able to stay within the 16-point spread, though, if not, maybe even pull off the shocker. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, these weeks where the slate doesn't quite pop as much as some of the others, they almost always bring some crazy upset that really seems to come out of nowhere. This is a 3-possession spread, but Alabama did look pretty sluggish last week too until the final 5 minutes against USF. Maybe Wisconsin's crowd can help keep them in it. This is Wisconsin's 3rd consecutive home game and Alabama's 1st road game. Maybe the Badgers can play keep away like Boston College and Missouri, like I mentioned with time of possession, if they can take that Bill O'Brien approach and just keep the ball away from Jalen Milroe and that Alabama offense, and maybe they can force a turnover or two when Alabama does have the ball. Something like that can really keep them in it. And perhaps this is a situation where Wisconsin has been kind of keeping the playbook shut for the first 2 weeks and not really revealing too much, not really using anything that they're trying to save for Alabama, and more or less putting all their eggs into one basket here, so to speak, to try to be able to pull off this win over Alabama. But I do think Alabama wins this game, and I wouldn't be all that surprised if it was like a 10-point margin and Alabama tacked on a late touchdown to cover the spread and win by 17 or something like that. But who knows? I'm hoping for a good game, but I think the Tide gets it done. Memphis makes the trip down to Tallahassee to take on Florida State. FSU, despite their rough start to the season, is a 6.5-point favorite. Over-under is 52.5, giving us an implied score of 30-23 Seminoles. This game is massive and one of the matchups that I'm looking forward to the most in Week 3. The meaning of the game is pretty self-explanatory for Florida State. They're 0-2. Memphis is Mike Norvell's former team, where he was before he took the job in Tallahassee. And this is just a must-win game for Mike Norvell and the Florida State program. I mean, if they come into the season ranked in the top 10 with aspirations to defend their ACC title, to get into the college football playoff, the mindset coming in was they got left out last year, but now that can't happen. If they win the ACC, they have an auto bid, they're guaranteed a spot, and they can fight for that national championship like they weren't given the opportunity to do last year. So they have all these expectations coming into the season, and now there's a very, very real possibility that they can start 0-3. And the emphasis of this game, the meaning of this game, is massive for not only this season, of course, for Florida State, but just their entire program and the trajectory of it. Memphis has college football playoff aspirations of their own. They returned a ton of production from last year's 10-win team, and I predicted them before the season to be the Group of 5 representative in the expanded playoff this year. So they've looked very good so far. They beat their FCS opponent 40-0, and they beat Troy by 3 touchdowns last week. And now they have a huge opportunity to pick up a Power 4 win, a major non-conference win, to help build that resume for later in the year. Florida State hasn't done anything this season to really instill any confidence in someone to pick them to win this game. It's a noon kick also. I don't know what the buy-in is from the fan base anymore, what the home field advantage will look like, or if it factors into the game at all. A good portion of that stadium is off limits anyway due to the construction and everything that they've had going on over the offseason. They just lost Jalen Lucas, a running back, and their primary kick returner for the season. The only case I think Florida State has here is if DJ Uiagalelei pulls out one of those 2020 games he had when he was at Clemson. He threw for 800 yards in a 2-game span when Trevor Lawrence went out. But if they can get that semblance of a deep ball, if they can get DJ to complete just the easy passes, like the wide open one in the end zone that he missed against Boston College, if they can use DJ as a runner to pick up first downs, stuff like that, then they might be able to earn their first win of the season this week. That is yet to be seen, though, and I'd be very uncomfortable picking them to win this game. I'll take Memphis to cover. I think the final score can probably go either way, but if FSU does win it, I think Memphis will at least stay within 7. Staying in the state of Florida, another game with massive implications for one of the programs involved is Texas A&M on the road at Florida. The Aggies are a 4.5-point favorite. The over-under is 46.5, giving us an implied score of 25-21 Texas A&M. So to put it plainly, Florida really needs this game. The Week 1 loss to Miami was bad, but if they were to lose this game too, it'll get very, very uncomfortable in Gainesville, even more so than it already has been with Billy Napier and the questions around his job. The Gators bounced back last week a little bit. They beat Samford 45-7. Graham Mertz was out with a concussion, but DJ Lagway came in and threw for 456 yards, which was the most of any quarterback in week 2, and the most passing yards by a true freshman in a single game in Florida history, which is pretty crazy. He's started one game and already has a program record. Billy Napier said earlier this week that the Gators will play both Mertz and Lagway moving forward, and it'll be interesting to see how that works out over the coming weeks. Texas A&M bounced back from their opening week loss to Notre Dame with a 52-10 victory over McNeese, Mike Elko's first win as the Aggies head coach. These two teams have had pretty similar starts. Lost at home in a major matchup in week 1, very, very rough offensive play in those games, and then bounce back wins over FCS, and now they're trying to get their first Power 4 wins of the season in week 3. The biggest key this week in deciding the outcome of the game is if Florida's defense can get to Connor Wigman. And if they can't, then if their secondary has made any improvements from where they were against Miami. And Connor Wigman is quite far from Cam Ward right now, just in terms of what Florida's defense is going to have to face. Ward he's been phenomenal. I mean, he's probably the Heisman front runner, if not, second or third, maybe behind Janty at Boise State. And he really picked apart that Florida defense. So I think Wigman is a significantly better matchup for the Gators in terms of him not being quite as dynamic out of the pocket. So if Florida's pass rush and guys like Justice Boone and LJ McCray and Cameron James and maybe a few blitzes from the linebackers, if they can get to Wigman and shorten those drives, keep the crowd in the swamp in the game for longer, and get the ball back to Mertz and Lagway, I think they have a shot in this game. With Texas A&M's offense not being quite as explosive as Miami's, and points probably being at a premium in this game, I think the score will be very tight. I think the crowd will be involved for much longer than they were against the Canes, and I think the Gators will find a way to come out on top. A couple other games that I wanted to touch on here were the former Pac-12 rivalry games, which are now taking place in week 3 instead of Thanksgiving weekend, which is a travesty, but at least they're still being played, which is a positive. But both of these matchups had been played in late November for over 115 years until now. So now it's a September 14th non-conference game, which is absolutely disgusting. But Washington State at Washington and number 9 Oregon at Oregon State, two very interesting games here. Oregon at Oregon State is really cool in terms of what it could do for the Beavers. The Ducks have not impressed in either game they've played. They beat Boise State, who may end up being that Group of 5 college football playoff representative and a future Pac-12 team, by the way. That news was announced last night. But they still got run all over by Ashton Janty and needed a late comeback and a field goal to win 37-34. They were also in a dogfight with Idaho in week 1. So they've had two very close games at home with non-power conference opposition, and now their first road game of the year is at a rival who is going to be especially fired up after what happened to them conference-wise, in part due to Oregon's decision to leave and go to the Big Ten, and that's going to be a very hostile environment in Reser Stadium. This is another one of those games in a boring, quote-unquote, sleepy Week 3 slate, like we've heard all week, where there's not a ton of crazy anticipated matchups, but a major shocker almost always happens. And Oregon is a 16-point favorite, over under 50, implied score of 33-17, basically almost the exact same thing as Alabama-Wisconsin. One thing of note here is that Oregon has lost in their last 2 trips to Corvallis in 2022 and 2020, 2 games in which they were also favored to win. If you haven't kept up with the Beavers this year, they're 2-0 with a 38-15 victory over Idaho State and a 21-0 victory over San Diego State, a future Pac-12 member and a future conference mate for the Beavers as well. So very stout on defense, though. They have a monster running back duo in Ole Miss transfer Jam Griffin, who was actually with Oregon State before transferring to Ole Miss and has since come back, and then Colorado transfer Anthony Hankerson. Against Idaho State, Griffin had 20 carries for 160 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Hankerson had 24 carries for 155 yards and 2 touchdowns. Then last week against San Diego State, Griffin had 18 carries for 89 yards and a touchdown. Hankerson had 16 carries for 71 yards and a touchdown. They have a 2-headed monster in the running back room, and if Janty at Boise State was able to put up 192 yards and 3 touchdowns last week on the Ducks, then Griffin and Hankerson may be able to have a huge day and be those primary contributors in the Beavers keeping this a close game. Another interesting avenue that this game offers is Oregon State's chances at the college football playoff. And after all the realignment and everything that happened last year that destroyed the Pac-12 and left the Beavers out in the cold, they have no conference title to win. They don't play a Power 4 schedule. If you don't know, they have a scheduling agreement with the Mountain West. But their chances to compete for a college football playoff spot looked very, very slim, if not non-existent. But should they pull off an upset in this game over a top 10 team, and a team who many people picked to not only win the Big Ten, but compete for the national title, who knows what might be possible for the Beavers down the road if one of those at-large spots is available. I'd say the most likely outcome of this game is that Oregon wins, but Oregon State covers. I think the Beavers are slightly underrated, and I'll go with them to stay within that 16-point spread, and I'll also touch on that at the end of the episode. Washington State at Washington will be a fun one as well. The Huskies are a 4.5-point favorite. The over-under is 55.5, giving us an implied score of 30-26 Washington. Both teams are 2-0. The Cougars have an electric offense. They scored 70 on their FCS team in week 1, and then 37 on Texas Tech in a 21-point victory over the Red Raiders last week. Washington, under new head coach Jedd Fisch, has been very sharp, very efficient, with wins over Weber State 35-3 and Eastern Michigan 30-9. So 65-12 through 2 games so far for the Huskies, which is very impressive defensively. This program was in the national championship last year, and it's very odd to see how quiet things have been for them so far this season, but they haven't really had a major matchup, and this week will be very intriguing to see what both teams can do, really. If Washington State can get into the national conversation despite their conference situation, or if Washington can earn the win and become more of a threat in the Big Ten this year. I don't have a super strong feel on this one. I'm slightly leaning Washington State. The Huskies are a 4.5-point favorite, but I think the Cougars can potentially win this game outright, if not at least lose by a field goal or something like that. But no real strong feel here. But if I had to go one way or the other, I'd go with the Cougars. Number 18 LSU travels to South Carolina this week, and a lot has been made of this game. And personally, I don't think it's as big of a game as it's been kind of built up to be this week with College Game Day going there and stuff, but still a cool matchup. South Carolina has a ton of momentum coming off their 25-point beatdown of Kentucky and Lexington last week. They went into that game as 10-point underdogs and just took it to the Wildcats. LSU had kind of a slow week against FCS Nicholls State. It took them until the third quarter to get some separation, but they did end up winning 44-21. South Carolina almost lost to Old Dominion in week 1, so each team has kind of had an underwhelming game so far. The biggest key for this matchup on Saturday will be South Carolina's pass rush, and if they can disrupt the LSU offense, which is run through quarterback Garrett Nussmeier. Nussmeier is tied for the lead in the FBS in passing touchdowns with 8, and he's going to need to be really sharp in order for them to win this game. LSU is a 7-point favorite, over-under of 49.5, implied score 28-21 Tigers. So LSU recently lost starting running back John Emery for the season. He had 10 carries for 61 yards against USC in week 1, which was a pretty significant blow there. But if South Carolina can get to Nussmeier and force them to try to work to that running game more, despite missing a major weapon in Emery, the Gamecocks could potentially pull this off. I do think LSU has the better team, though, and I think this is a situation for South Carolina where people might be reading a little bit too much into that game against Kentucky last week. They were impressive without a doubt, but I think LSU will get back on track, and I think they'll get the job done on Saturday. A couple other games just to put on your radar if you haven't looked too deeply into the slate this week. Arizona State goes on the road to Texas State, a Power 4 at Group of 5 game, which I always love. That's tonight on Thursday, so if you're watching right after this episode is uploaded, then we've got a good one tonight. But the Bobcats are one of the more underrated Group of 5 teams so far this season. They're kind of working their way into that conversation to potentially be one of the Group of 5 CFP contenders, especially after what they did last week. In week 2, they were just a 2-point favorite over UTSA and beat them 49-10. They beat them by almost 20 times the spread. Jordan McLeod, transfer quarterback from James Madison, has been awesome for them this year. He had 339 total yards and 4 total touchdowns last week. Similar to Oregon State, Texas State has 2 very good running backs that they've used a lot throughout the first couple games. Arizona State's running back is a beast as well, and I'll get to him in just a second. But Lincoln Perry and Ismail Mahdi for Texas State have been incredible. Mahdi had 28 carries for 156 yards and a touchdown in week 1. And then Lincoln Perry had 11 carries for 109 yards and 2 touchdowns in week 2. They also have guys like Deion Hankins and Torrance Burgess Jr. as well. Arizona State's Cam Scatabo was a king of the week in the last episode for his week 2 performance. Against Mississippi State, he had 33 carries for 262 yards and then 3 receptions for 37 yards as well. So the running backs will be a ton of fun to watch in this one. Arizona State is a 1.5 point favorite. They're going on the road to Texas State. The over-under is 59.5, implied score of 31-29 Sun Devils. And no prediction on this one. I really have hardly any feel at all. But just hoping for a good game, and I think it'll be one of the more entertaining ones of the week. A couple other keep your eye on type games. Number 1, Georgia goes on the road to Kentucky. And I know that doesn't sound like much given where both teams are. Kentucky was just beaten by 25 by South Carolina, and Georgia looks really solid. However, Georgia looked really solid, and Kentucky was very average back in 2020 and 2022 as well. I pointed this out in my CFP predictions episode a couple weeks ago, but Georgia's season low point total in 2020 was on the road at Kentucky, and Georgia's season low point total in 2022 was on the road at Kentucky. They beat the Wildcats 14-3 in 2020 and 16-6 in 2022. And neither of those Kentucky teams were anything special, and the Dogs went 15-0 and won the national title in 2022. So it hasn't seemed to matter what kind of caliber of team Kentucky is versus the kind of caliber of team that we know Georgia is. They just have not scored much there lately. And for Kentucky, getting your doors blown off as double-digit favorites at home might give them a little bit of a different attitude this week. We also have UNLV at Kansas tomorrow night, Friday night that is, at 7 p.m. Eastern on ESPN. Tulane at number 15 Oklahoma. Tulane nearly beat Kansas State, and Oklahoma was in an ugly 16-12 game with Houston, and that Houston team was beaten by 20 by UNLV in week 1. So could get pretty interesting there in Norman. Number 18 Notre Dame goes on the road to Purdue. Can the Irish bounce back after a devastating loss to Northern Illinois last week? App State at East Carolina, fun game in the group of 5. The backyard brawl between West Virginia and Pitt, always a ton of fun there between those two teams. Maryland at Virginia, one of the more underrated games of the week. But the Cavaliers are looking to start 3-0 after winning only 3 games all of last season. Anthony Calandria is electric at quarterback, so if you get a chance to watch that one, make sure to dial in. UCF at TCU as well, getting into Big 12 play there. Could be an entertaining matchup. Number 5 Ole Miss travels to Wake Forest, another game where everyone you know is probably picking Ole Miss, and they very well may be right, but this is a week where some chaos could potentially ensue. So week 3 slate is not one that the generic media is going to be super hyped up for, but it's college football. There's a lot of underrated games and a bunch of matchups that I actually think are very good, so really excited for it. Okay, to wrap up here, I wanted to offer a few picks that caught my eye for week 3 slate. I wanted to preface again, like last week, by saying that if you don't engage in any wagering, probably just keep it that way. And if you don't even care about it, if you don't want to hear about it, feel free to check out now. It's just a couple picks here, a couple minutes. But if you do, be smart about it. Pretty simple, just set some rules, stick to them, be wise. Don't believe what you see in all these commercials. Don't believe what you see on social media. Half of that stuff is not real, so don't feel like you're missing out or anything, because there's a lot more losing than there is winning. But yeah, stay smart. Last week we went 3-0. I mentioned it at the end of the week 2 recap episode, but we had Pitt money line. They beat Cincinnati by 1. They trailed that game by 21 and needed a remarkable late comeback in order to cover, but they got it done. We had Clemson minus 16.5. That game was never in doubt. They beat App State by 46. We had Virginia money line against Wake Forest. They trailed by 13 in the fourth quarter and scored 2 touchdowns late to beat Wake Forest by 1. So 3-0, a couple of very fortunate breaks there, but yeah, hopefully we have some similar success this week. Definitely can't guarantee it, but hopefully we'll hit a few. First up, I have a pretty specific one. I've got Montrell Johnson Jr. at Florida going over 17.5 yards on his longest rush of the game. So any carry at any point, we just need him to have one of 18 yards or more. And he's had a bunch of long ones lately. He had a 75-yarder or something like that against Miami. Texas A&M's defense gave up multiple long runs late in the game to Notre Dame. And I just think Montrell Johnson, with the quarterback situation at Florida, switching between Mertz and Lagway, I think they might lean on him a little bit, and he might be able to break one loose for 18 plus. All right, next up we've got Ole Miss's first half under 23.5 against Wake Forest. So we just need them to score anything under 24 before halftime. 23.5 is kind of a dirty line. It's not super comfortable. I'd be a lot more comfortable with it if it was 24.5 and we could get that 3 touchdowns and a field goal number. But yeah, just anything under 24. So 3 touchdowns at 21, 2 touchdowns and 2 field goals at 20, something like that. But yeah, the reason that this caught my eye is because this is Ole Miss's first Power 4 opponent and first road game. So Wake Forest got to play Virginia last week. They got to play, a conference member. They got to play a Power 4 team, obviously. And that was a game that they really could have won. Even though we had Virginia, there were multiple opportunities where Wake Forest could have won that game. And they fumbled them away, both figuratively and literally. They actually did fumble at the end of the game, but there were just a lot of opportunities in that game that they missed. And for Ole Miss, for context, they had 31 at the half on Middle Tennessee last week. That was their first FBS opponent. Now they're moving to Wake Forest. They're going on the road. They're playing a Power 4 team. I think they might just get off to a little slow start. I think Ole Miss will win this game, but I do think it might take them just a minute to kind of get into a rhythm, and I think they'll be under 24 in the first half. Next up, we've got Oregon State plus 16.5 against Oregon. And quick reminder here for all these lines, if you're watching it a little while after it's been uploaded on Friday night or Saturday morning even, just remember that if you're not seeing these exact numbers, especially this early in the season, the lines can be very, very volatile. So they can change between, half point, a point and a half, 2 points very, very quickly. So yeah, just keep that in mind. But right now, Oregon State plus 16.5. I think Oregon State will be able to stay within 16.5, if not even potentially have themselves in position to win this game late. And the reason that I like this one is because of those 2 running backs in Griffin and Hankerson and what they've been able to do so far, as well as what Jeanty was able to do against Oregon last week. And of course, Ashton's a very good running back. He's kind of in a league of his own right now. But him running for almost 200 yards and 3 touchdowns doesn't exactly bode well for Oregon's defense this week, unless they've made some major adjustments with this 2-headed monster that Oregon State has in the backfield. If the Beavers can control the pace of the game, if they can rack up some time of possession, if they can keep the ball away from Dylan Gabriel in that explosive Oregon offense, I think they'll be able to at least cover the 16.5 point spread. And like I said, with the whole week 3 thing, the whole lackluster slate or whatever everybody's been saying, this is one of those games where I could definitely see an upset happening. And top 10 matchup, it's a rivalry game. It's Oregon's first trip on the road. Very similar to Ole Miss, first road trip and first game against a Power 4 opponent. It's also Oregon State's first game against a Power 4 opponent, but they do get the Ducks at home. That's going to be a crazy environment. I know those fans are really hyped up to see Oregon come in there after everything that happened with the Pac-12. So, yeah, very interesting line there. I think Oregon State can stay within 16.5. Then we've got Auburn, New Mexico over 60.5. And I really like this one because I feel like it's kind of off the radar. It's very kind of an underrated game here, but Auburn's a 4-touchdown favorite to preface. But the offenses in this game I think can really score. And you're not going to see that last week with how Auburn played. They lost 21-14 to Cal. But the reason that I like this line is because I think a lot of people are underselling Cal's defense. Cal has a very, very talented defense. It was their strength last year, and I think it'll be their strength this year again, especially if Jaden Ott is banged up at running back for them. But New Mexico, too, I really like what they do on offense against Montana State, who is their FCS opponent, but they were very, very good last year. New Mexico scored 31, and against Arizona, they went on the road to Arizona and scored 39. Auburn in week 1 scored 73 on their FCS opponent, and I think this week they'll bounce back. That Cal defense forced 5 turnovers of Auburn. They picked off Peyton Thorne 4 times. And I think this week will kind of be a get-right game for that offense. I think Peyton Thorne will get back on track. I think they'll use Cam Coleman, that 5-star freshman wide receiver, a good bit in this game as well. And then Jacquez Hunter at running back as well. So, yeah, I really like over 60.5 in this game. I think Auburn will win it. They're a 4-touchdown favorite. But, yeah, I also really like what Devin Dampier does at New Mexico. And if you don't know, New Mexico's head coach is Bronco Mendenhall. So he's been in these types of games before. He was Virginia's head coach a little while back, and I think he was at Boise State before that. But yeah, he's been in these types of environments. He's been in these types of games, and maybe they'll tack on a touchdown late to potentially pull this game a little bit closer and get us over 60. And lastly, to wrap it up here, I've got Notre Dame Purdue under 45.5. And this one's pretty self-explanatory. It might not work out, but this one I saw it and I was like, wow. It might end up being like the most off one I have, but it also feels like the most obvious. Notre Dame's defense is, of course, their strong point. They've got one of the best secondaries in the country. Guys like Xavier Watts and Benjamin Morrison, Aiden Schuler, Christian Gray, those guys are all phenomenal. And then Purdue, like I mentioned with Missouri, there are two teams in the FBS who have not given up a point this year. Those are Missouri and Purdue. Purdue's only played one game, and it was against their FCS team, but they beat them 49-0. So that defense is obviously at least somewhat impressive so far with what we can know through two games. But yeah, I think Notre Dame will bounce back a little bit. I think that defense will be sharp. I think Purdue's can be the same way as well. And I can see that game being under 46 points. Okay, so 5 picks this week, up from the 3 for week 2. But yeah, last week I had 2 others in addition to those 3 that I was kind of on the fence on, but didn't really ever offer them as real picks. But yeah, the 5 that I was looking at last week went 4-1. So hopefully we can replicate that success a little bit here in week 3. But yeah, I really like what we've got, and make sure to comment down below if you've got anything that caught your eye as well. So yeah, that's going to wrap up this episode of the show. Really appreciate you tuning in, especially if you made it all the way to the end. I really like what we've got here in week 3, and looking forward to what everybody's calling an underwhelming slate, but I think it might be a very exciting one. So yeah, make sure to subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Make sure to follow if you're listening on Spotify, and follow at CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.